who is the court supposed to be accountable to? And how is the court supposed to be accountable? And how have they changed that? And then tell our listeners about that Alito quote and why it's so telling.
I love the Alito quote. We'll end with Justice Alito, the Phillies fan. So the Constitution enshrines an independent court, and it protects independence by giving the justices, protection against removal except for bad behavior, by barring Congress from reducing their salaries. But in every other respect, Bethany, Congress calls the punches. Congress calls the plays. Congress pulls the strings. Congress decides when the court sits, where the court sits, what cases the court hears, how many justices there are. And Congress, Bethany, for the better part of 175 years, pulled all of those levers as a way of basically keeping the court loosely in line, not to say rule this way in this case, but as a way of saying, hey, we're just, the more that you are basically generally behaving, the nicer we're going to be to you. And the less well you behave, the meaner we're going to be to you. And that, it wasn't always perfect, Bethany. It didn't always produce like great decisions, but it did mean that justices were looking over their shoulder, perhaps the most visible example of which was when Justice Abe Fortas resigned in 1969. By the way, the very last time there was a majority of the court appointed by Democratic presidents. He resigned because he was convinced by Chief Justice Earl Warren that if he didn't resign because of this ethical and financial scandal, Congress would come after the court, right? That was a big part of that move. Fast forward to the Alito quote. So a couple of years ago, Justice Alito gives this interview to the Wall Street Journal, and he says something along the lines of, quote, I know this is a controversial position, but I'm willing to say it, which my edit, always a good way to start a quote. He says, no provision in the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate the Supreme Court, period. The period is his, which is literally incorrect. Article 3, Section 2, the part of the Constitution that talks about the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, literally says Congress can make regulations that control the cases the court hears. But he's capturing, Bethany, this broader thing that's in the zeitgeist, which is Congress has stopped doing that. Congress has stopped using the court's budget as leverage, using the justices' pensions as leverage, using its control over the court's docket as leverage. And so when you have a court that is completely unrestrained, it's no wonder that the court's going to just run in the direction of its ideological majority, whereas at prior points in American history, that wasn't true.
So sometime in the mid-teens, an economist named Mohammed El-Arian wrote a book about the Fed called The Only Game in Town. And in that book, he argued that the Fed felt it had no choice to take more and more responsibility for the economy, even in ways that sat outside, obviously, any kind of constitutional oversight, because Congress just simply wasn't doing it. So does that argument apply to the Supreme Court, that it too feels it's the only game in town? And
100%.
if so, then isn't the fault in the end Congress's?
Yes. I realize I'm sort of swinging at the lowest hanging fruit in the history of fruit to say, yes, it's Congress's fault. But I think
I guess I did tee that up, didn't I? Anyway.
No, that's okay. But Bethany, it's worth explaining that I think it's Congress's fault in multiple different ways, none of which are partisan. So way number one is Congress no longer being the dominant voice of domestic policy, right? That's what creates all of this gap for presidents and or courts to rush in to fill. But number two, Congress is also the reason why the court has been able to aggrandize all this power over the last decade or so, because there have been no consequences as it's done it. The court is deciding more and more cases through these emergency applications. That's something Congress could control. It's just chosen not to, right? The court has taken truly bizarre interpretations of statutes, and Congress has left them untouched. The court has articulated a brand new theory of what Congress must do to regulate domestic policy issues. And Congress has sort of rolled over and said, okay, right? And so Congress is enabling this mush, both by not regulating directly and by not checking the other branches as they're claiming the power Congress has left on the field. So it's like Congress is responsible at both ends of the equation.
So if you had to advise Biden in 2021, maybe you were advising Biden, or the next Democratic president, if there will ever be one, with a majority, what are the changes you want Congress to do to go in the direction you want?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a laundry list, but I think the most important thing to say before ticking off some of the items on the laundry list is that the list as the whole is greater than the sum of its parts here, right? My goal is for Congress just to get back in the business of nudging the court, no matter what the nudges are. But just a few things I'd like Congress to do. One, I would like Congress to make more of the court's docket mandatory again. Right, the Supreme Court today picks basically 99% of the cases it hears. That's only been true since 1988. For the first 102 years of the court's history, it had no control over its docket. Even until 1925, it had very little control over its docket. Now it's at the other extreme. I think it would be very, very modest for Congress to say, actually, Supreme Court, we want you working a little harder, and we want you taking cases you wouldn't otherwise be inclined to take, maybe because they're not quite the cotton candy, ideological disputes. So one is docket reform. Two, I want an inspector general. Not just for the Supreme Court, but for the entire federal judiciary, someone who can actually provide objective assessments of whether the justices are complying with all of these ethical and financial disclosure rules, of whether Justice Thomas really did violate federal tax law. That shouldn't be litigated in the court of public opinion. It should actually have an official whose job it is to investigate that. Three, I want Congress to have the justices testify before Congress again. That used to happen all the time. There's this remarkable video from 2001 of Justice Kennedy testifying ostensibly for the Supreme Court's budget before a House committee where the members just kept yelling at him about Bush versus Gore. I think that's helpful. I think that's inter-branch accountability, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And four, and I think just more generally, I want Congress to get back in the business of exerting institutional authority over the court. If the court adopts an interpretation of a statute that Congress didn't mean, in the old days, Congress would just pass a new statute in like a day and a half. Now that doesn't happen anymore. So, it's a list that can go on and on and on, but those are the big ones. And it's all about just sort of the court being reminded that it is one branch among three, as opposed to this aloof, insulated entity on a hill.